My name is Matilda Hawthorne, and I am 26 years old now. For most of my life, I was the shadow in the corner of the family portrait, the quiet one with a book always open on her lap, while my beautiful sister, Rosaline, captured all the light. I never imagined that my quiet little hobby, my love for the dusty, leather-bound histories of the English peerage, would end up saving my family from absolute ruin. It became a weapon against a devastatingly charming liar, and in trying to protect the very people who always overlooked me, I uncovered a secret that would completely redefine all of our lives. It's a strange thing when the one part of you that everyone dismisses as peculiar turns out to be your greatest strength. Before I tell you how a single misplaced date and a conversation about ancestry began to unravel a grand deception, I'd love it if you let me know where you are watching from today in the comments below. And if you've ever had a gut feeling that something was wrong, even when everyone else told you that you were crazy, please hit that like button so I know I'm not alone. And for all of you who are new here, please consider subscribing to join our community of people who understand that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who sees the most. Our family, the Hawthornes, existed in that precarious social stratum, just below the true aristocracy. We had a comfortable home, a respectable name, and just enough money to maintain the appearance of significance. My father, a man whose ambition always outpaced his station, saw society as a ladder, and his primary objective in life was to see his children climb it. My mother was his loyal and often ruthless lieutenant in this campaign. And their perfect soldier, their greatest asset, was my elder sister, Rosaline. It's not an exaggeration to say Rosaline was born radiant. She had hair the color of spun gold, eyes the blue of a summer sky, and a laugh that could charm birds from the trees. She was graceful, witty in a light and unthreatening way, and she wore the weight of our family's hopes as if it were a feather-light shawl. She was the sun, and I, Matilda, was the quiet planet orbiting her, content in my predictable, shadowy path. My hair was a plain brown, my eyes a simple hazel, and my disposition was one of quiet observation. Where Rosaline collected suitors, I collected books. My sanctuary was our family's library, a sprawling, slightly neglected room filled with the scent of aging paper and leather polish. It was there I discovered my passion for genealogy, for the intricate, tangled webs of lineage that connected the great families of England. To my parents, it was a harmless, if dusty, eccentricity. At least it keeps her out from underfoot. I once heard my mother tell a visiting neighbor, her voice carrying easily through the slightly ajar library door. The words didn't sting as much as they simply confirmed a fact I already knew. In the grand production of the Hawthorne family, I was merely part of the scenery. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, a day that had, until that moment, been utterly unremarkable. It was sealed with a formidable wax crest, a griffin rampant, which I recognized instantly, Ainsworth. My father broke the seal with hands that trembled slightly, his face a mask of barely contained excitement. He read it aloud, his voice growing more pompous with each word. The 9th Duke of Ainsworth, a man whose name was whispered with an almost mythical reverence in our circles, would be traveling through our county. Having heard of my father's small but respectable collection of historical manuscripts, he requested the honor of a brief visit, perhaps to stay for a few days to examine them. A shockwave of pure, unadulterated ambition ripped through our household. A duke, a real, actual duke, was coming to stay. In my father's eyes, this was not a visit, it was a divine intervention. My mother immediately began a frantic campaign of preparations that resembled the mobilization of a small army. Drapes were taken down, carpets were beaten, silver was polished until it gleamed with a blinding ferocity, and menus were planned with the gravity of treaty negotiations. And at the center of it all was Rosaline. She was polished and prepped like a prized filly before a race. New gowns were commissioned, her hair was styled in a dozen different ways, and she was drilled by my mother on ducal etiquette. Rosaline, you must remember to laugh at his anecdotes, but not too loudly. Appear intelligent, but never so much as to challenge him. The Duke of Ainsworth is unmarried, you understand. This is not a visit, this is an opportunity. Perhaps the opportunity of a lifetime. Rosaline, to her credit, took it all in stride. She seemed genuinely excited, caught up in the romance of it all. Who wouldn't be? A duke was coming, and he was coming, ostensibly for her. I was, as usual, assigned a background role. Matilda, for heaven's sake, try to look presentable. And please do not bore his grace with your endless talk of dusty old families. No one is interested. My mother's instructions were clear. I was to be seen and not heard. I was to be pleasant, smiling, and above all, invisible. I didn't mind. The impending chaos meant more uninterrupted time for me in the library. I could observe the spectacle from a safe distance. The day of his arrival felt charged, the very air in our house thick with anticipation. We stood in the entrance hall, a perfect tableau of the eager provincial family. My father puffed up in his best suit, my mother rigid with social anxiety, Rosaline, a vision in pale blue silk, her cheeks flushed with excitement. I stood slightly behind them, in a simple gray dress my mother had deemed unobjectionable. The carriage that pulled up was impressive, lacquered black and drawn by 4 magnificent gray horses. The door was opened by a footman, and out stepped the Duke of Ainsworth, or the man who called himself the Duke of Ainsworth. His name, he announced in a voice as smooth and rich as velvet, was Percy Blackwood. He was breathtaking, taller than my father with a cascade of dark wavy hair, eyes the color of twilight, and a smile that could disarm armies. He moved with an easy, confident grace that spoke of generations of breeding. He bowed over my mother's hand, and she very nearly swooned. He complimented my father on the approach to the house, and my father practically preened. And then he turned to Rosaline. His eyes swept over her, a slow, appreciative gaze that made her blush from her throat to the roots of her golden hair. "Miss Hawthorne," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur, "I was told your beauty was renowned in this county. As usual, rumor has failed to do justice to reality." Rosaline was lost. We all were. He was everything a duke was supposed to be. Everything we had read about in novels and dreamed of in our most ambitious fantasies. He was perfect. Almost too perfect. Following him out of the carriage was another man, almost an afterthought. He was of average height, with sandy brown hair, plain features, and a quiet, unassuming demeanor. He was dressed neatly but without flair, in a simple dark suit. Percy introduced him with a dismissive wave of his hand. "And this is my secretary, Mr. Robert Finch. He handles my affairs." Mr. Finch gave a short, polite bow, his eyes cast downward. My parents gave him a curt nod, their attention already swinging back to the dazzling Duke. He was staff, hired help. He blended into the wallpaper, immediately forgotten. He began directing the footman with the luggage, his voice low and efficient. But as he passed me, his eyes met mine for a brief, fleeting moment. There was an intelligence there, a watchfulness that seemed at odds with his subservient role, and something else too. A flicker of what looked like weariness, as if he had seen this performance 100 times before. The next few days were a blur of orchestrated charm. Percy, or Your Grace as my parents insisted everyone call him, held our entire household captive. He told thrilling stories of his travels on the continent, of hunting expeditions in Scotland, of glittering balls in London. He was an artist, and my family was his canvas. He painted a future for them, for Rosaline, that was more dazzling than they had ever imagined. He spoke of the Ainsworth estate, Blackwood Manor, with its 100 rooms, its famous art collection, its sprawling gardens. Rosaline would be its duchess, the mistress of it all. The courtship was swift and brutally effective. He and Rosaline walked in the gardens, their heads close together. He played the piano for her in the evenings, his long, elegant fingers dancing over the keys. My parents watched from the sidelines, their faces aglow with triumph. Their ship had not just come in, a whole dockal fleet had sailed into their harbor. I watched it all, mostly from the quiet of the library. And it was there that the first tiny dissonant note was struck. Percy was in the drawing room one afternoon, regaling my father with tales of his heroic ancestors. Of course, my great-great-grandfather, the 7th Duke, was a true hero, he declared, his voice ringing with false modesty. He personally led the charge at the Battle of Fuentes de Oñoro in 1811, a feat for which Wellington himself commended him. My father was suitably impressed. But in my mind, a small, stubborn cog turned. Fuentes de Oñoro, the 7th Duke. I was almost certain that was wrong. The 7th Duke of Ainsworth had been a politician, a cabinet minister, not a soldier. It was his younger brother, a General Finch Courtenay, who had been the celebrated war hero. A small mistake, easily made, a slip of the tongue. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself I was being pedantic, that I was looking for flaws where there were none. That evening at dinner, another small crack appeared. My mother, eager to show off our family's own minor connection to nobility, mentioned our distant relation to the Barons of Clavering. Percy smiled warmly. Ah, the Claverings, a fine old family. I knew the late Baron well, a terrible shame about his son Thomas, and that gambling scandal in Monaco. My parents nodded sagely, impressed by his intimate knowledge of society's goings-on. But my blood ran a little cold. The late Baron Clavering had 3 daughters. He never had a son. My mind raced. Who was this man? A man of his supposed station would know these things. These weren't obscure facts, they were common knowledge within the circles he claimed to move in. It was like a sailor not knowing the names of the tides. The details were small, almost insignificant on their own, but they were starting to accumulate like grains of sand forming a stone in my shoe. I decided I had to say something. I found my mother alone in her sitting room the next morning, arranging flowers. I took a deep breath. "Mother," I began, trying to keep my voice casual. "I was just thinking about what His Grace said last night, about the Baron Clavering's son. It's strange, because I was reading about them just last week, and I am quite certain the Baron only had daughters." My mother didn't even look up from her roses. "Matilda, do not be tedious," she said, her voice sharp. "Men of his station have countless acquaintances." He simply misspoke. "You spend too much time with your nose in those books, it makes you critical. It's not an attractive quality in a young woman." She snipped the head off a rose with a vicious little snap of her shears. "And what about the 7th Duke?" I pressed, feeling a new sense of urgency. "He wasn't a soldier, his brother was." She finally turned to look at me, her eyes cold. "Are you calling the Duke a liar?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "Is that what you are doing, Matilda? Are you so filled with jealousy for your sister's happiness that you would invent these wicked, petty stories to try and spoil it?" Jealousy. The accusation struck me like a physical blow. It was the simplest, cruelest explanation, and the one she would always reach for. It had nothing to do with facts or truth. It was about my perceived inadequacy next to Rosaline. I had no response. The truth, I was beginning to realize, didn't matter. They didn't want the truth. They wanted the Duke. Defeated, I retreated to my only sanctuary, the library. The familiar scent of old paper and leather was a comfort. If my family wouldn't listen to me, perhaps the books would. I pulled down Burke's Peerage, the definitive guide to the aristocracy, its heavy spine cool in my hands. I found the entry for Ainsworth. I began to read, not for pleasure this time, but with a hunter's focus. I cross-referenced with other genealogical texts, with historical biographies of the Wellington era, with maps of ancestral lands. I worked for hours, the setting sun casting long shadows across the room. I was so engrossed that I didn't hear him enter. A fascinating subject, the Ainsworth line. The voice was quiet, startling me. I looked up to see Mr. Finch standing a few feet away. He wasn't looking at me, but at the array of books spread across the large oak table. "It is full of interesting turns," he added, his voice neutral. "Pray, yes," I said, my heart still beating a little too fast. "Yes, it is." He stepped closer, his gaze falling on an open page detailing the family tree. "Many people only see the grand titles," he said, almost to himself. "They don't see the complexities. The younger sons, the daughters who marry away, the quiet branches of the family that hold the most interesting stories." His eyes met mine, and for the second time, I saw that flicker of something knowing, something intelligent. It was as if we were speaking in a code that only we understood. He gestured towards a volume on a high shelf. "May I?" he asked, reaching up to retrieve a book that was just out of my reach. It was a detailed history of the parliamentary careers of the peerage. "This one might have some answers you're looking for," he said, placing it gently on the table in front of me. He didn't say more. He simply gave a slight bow and retreated from the room as silently as he had entered, leaving me with the book, a new thread to pull on, and the unsettling feeling that I had just found a very unlikely and very quiet ally. The library no longer felt like a retreat. It felt like a battleground, and I had just been handed my new weapon. The book Mr. Finch had given me was a treasure trove. It was a dry academic text, the kind my father would call unreadable, but to me it was a key unlocking a series of doors. It contained letters, parliamentary records, and personal journals. I spent the next 2 days devouring it, my plate from dinner often left untouched on a side table as I worked late into the night, a single candle flickering beside me. The portrait of the true Ainsworth family that emerged from those pages was starkly different from the one Percy was painting in our drawing room. The records were unequivocal. The 8th Duke and his wife had died in a tragic carriage accident when their only son and heir, Robert, was just 10 years old. The boy, the new 9th Duke, had not been raised in a glittering London townhouse, but quietly, almost reclusively, on a remote estate in the north, under the guardianship of his scholarly, unassuming great-uncle. He had been educated by tutors, not at Eton or Oxford. He had, by all accounts, never been formally introduced to society. The peerage guides described him as something of a mystery. A young man who had inherited one of the most powerful titles in the kingdom, but had shown no interest in claiming his place in the public eye. Every fact I uncovered was another nail in the coffin of Percy's story. His tales of a lavish upbringing, of grand tours and royal levees were pure fantasy. He had claimed his mother was a French aristocrat. The record showed the late Duchess was the daughter of a Scottish earl. He had boasted about winning a rowing blue at Oxford. The real Duke had likely never set foot in the city. The discrepancies were no longer small slips of the tongue, they were the very foundation of a colossal lie. And the more certain I became, the more afraid I grew. Percy wasn't just a charming rogue telling tall tales to impress a provincial family. This was a calculated, audacious fraud. He was trying to steal not just our money, but Rosaline's entire future. My growing certainty must have shown on my face, because Percy began to watch me. His charming smile never wavered in public, but when he caught my eye across the dinner table, there was a coldness there, a reptilian stillness that chilled me. His attempts to intimidate me were subtle at first, designed to look like accidents. One afternoon, as I was carrying a fragile stack of books back to the library, he came striding around a corner, colliding with me. The books tumbled to the floor, one of them, a precious first edition, its spine cracking on the hard wood. "Oh, my deepest apologies, Matilda," he said, his voice dripping with false concern as he helped me gather them. "You must be more careful. So lost in your own world, you don't see what's right in front of you." His fingers brushed mine as he handed me the last book, his touch lingering a fraction of a second too long, a silent, menacing warning. Another evening, as the family sat in the drawing room listening to Rosaline play the piano, he walked over to the fireplace where I was sitting slightly apart from the group. He leaned against the mantelpiece, seemingly admiring a portrait, but his voice was low, for my ears only. "You know, there's a sad story about the Hawthorne Library," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the painting. "I heard that a terrible fire swept through it a century ago. All those irreplaceable records, all that history, turned to ash. A tragic loss. It shows how fragile the past can be, how easily it can be erased." He turned his head and gave me a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. It wasn't a story. It was a threat. He knew what I was doing, and he was telling me to stop. The fear was no longer a vague unease, it was a living thing, coiling in my stomach. He wasn't just a liar, he was dangerous. Armed with my new damning evidence and a growing sense of panic, I knew I had to try my family again. This was no longer about petty details, it was about protecting Rosaline. I chose my moment carefully, waiting until I could speak to my father alone in his study. I laid out my case, not with the hesitant uncertainty of before, but with a calm, desperate logic. I didn't offer opinions, I presented facts. I showed him the entry in Burke's peerage detailing the death of the 8th Duke and Duchess. I showed him the passage in the historical text about the young heir being raised in seclusion. I pointed out the direct contradictions in Percy's stories, one after another. My father listened, his face growing darker with every word I spoke. I thought for a fleeting, hopeful moment that I was getting through to him. I was wrong. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he rose from his desk, his fists clenched at his sides. "Enough," he said, his voice a low growl. "I have had enough of this. Do you have any idea what you are doing? A man of his grace's importance comes to our home, honors our family, shows a distinct and serious interest in your sister, and you try to destroy it all with this filth." He gestured dismissively at the books on his desk. "You have always been envious of Rosaline, of her beauty, of the attention she receives. But this is a new low, to concoct such a malicious fantasy out of pure spite. I am ashamed of you." My heart shattered. It wasn't just that he didn't believe me, he couldn't even conceive that my motives might be anything other than petty jealousy. He saw my evidence not as truth, but as a weapon I was using against my own sister. "I forbid you from mentioning this nonsense again," he finished, his voice trembling with rage. "Not to me, not to your mother, and certainly not to Rosaline. You will hold your tongue. If you breathe a word of this and ruin this opportunity, I swear to you, Matilda, you will regret it. You are on the verge of destroying this family." He didn't have to explain what he meant. I would be the scapegoat for their lost dream, the architect of their social ruin. I was utterly, completely alone. The weight of that isolation was crushing. I walked out of his study in a daze, the world feeling tilted and unreal. I wandered down the long, dim hallway, my hand trailing along the wall to steady myself. As I passed a shadowy alcove, a hand shot out and grabbed my arm. I let out a small, startled cry. It was Percy. His charming mask was gone entirely now. His face was a thunderous mask of fury, his grip on my arm painfully tight. "I thought I warned you," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "You are a foolish little girl, playing with things you don't understand. You need to stop your little games. Some books are best left on the shelf, and some secrets are best left buried. His fingers dug into my flesh, and for the first time I felt a surge of genuine physical fear. He was stronger than me. He could hurt me. No one would believe my word against his. In that moment, I felt a despair so profound it threatened to swallow me whole. Your Grace. The voice was quiet, but cut through the tension like a knife. You are needed in the drawing room. Sir Reginald has arrived and is asking for you. Mr. Finch was standing at the end of the hall, his expression unreadable, his posture calm. His sudden appearance was so unexpected that Percy flinched and immediately released my arm. Instantly, the charming facade slipped back into place. He smoothed his jacket, a practiced smile appearing on his lips. Ah, Mr. Finch, excellent. I was just having a word with the dear Matilda. He gave me a look that was both a dismissal and a final chilling threat, then turned and strode down the hall towards the drawing room. I stood there trembling, rubbing the sore spot on my arm where his fingers had bruised me. Mr. Finch walked towards me. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, then at my arm, and a flicker of something hard and angry crossed his face before being suppressed. His eyes met mine, and his look said everything. I saw. I know. Be careful. It was the first time anyone in that house had looked at me and seen the truth. It was a lifeline. Later that evening, I couldn't bear the oppressive cheer of the drawing room. I slipped out into the garden, seeking the cool night air. The moon was high, casting the manicured lawns in silver and shadow. I heard a soft footstep on the gravel behind me. I turned, my heart leaping into my throat, expecting Percy. It was Mr. Finch. He hurt you, he said. It wasn't a question. I am fine, I lied, wrapping my arms around myself. No, you are not, he replied, his voice gentle but firm. And you are in danger. We stood in silence for a moment, the sounds of the night, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves, filling the space between us. You are right, you know, he finally said, his gaze fixed on the distant woods. About all of it. You are right to be suspicious. My breath hitched. To hear it spoken aloud, to have my fears validated by someone else, was an almost overwhelming relief. Who are you? I whispered. He sighed, a heavy sound in the quiet dark. My name is Robert Finch. I am his secretary. For now that is all I can say. I am bound by certain obligations, a promise to observe. But I cannot stand by and watch that man harm an innocent person. Not anymore. He turned to face me, his plain features earnest in the moonlight. He is not the Duke of Ainsworth. His name is Percy Blackwood, and he was, for a short time, a valet to a distant cousin of the late Duke. He's a gambler, a cheat, and a very convincing liar. He saw an opportunity in the true Duke's reclusiveness, and he seized it. Then why are you with him? I asked, confused. To watch him, Robert said simply. To see how far he would go, to understand the nature of the people he would try to deceive. It was an experiment, one that has gone on too long, and become too dangerous. He looked towards the brightly lit windows of my home. Your family, he said, his voice laced with a frustration that mirrored my own. They will not believe you. Words are not enough. They are blinded by what they want to see. To expose him, we need proof that is public, irrefutable, and humiliating. We have to shatter the illusion so completely that they have no choice but to see the truth. An idea began to form in my mind, sparked by his words. The dinner party, I said. My parents are hosting a large dinner party for him in 3 days, to announce the engagement. The words tasted like poison. Robert nodded slowly. Who is coming? Local society. The vicar, some landowners, and Sir Henry Belgrave. Robert's head snapped up. The magistrate. Yes, he's a friend of my father's, and a noted historian on the side. He prides himself on his knowledge of the peerage. Robert's expression became sharp, focused. That's it, he said, a new energy in his voice. That's our moment. Sir Henry cannot be fooled or charmed. His word will be unassailable. He looked at me, a glimmer of admiration in his eyes. You have the knowledge, Miss Hawthorne, all your research. We just need to create the stage. We stood there in the moonlight, two quiet, overlooked people, and we began to formulate a plan. Robert would provide me with one final, crucial piece of information, a detail so intimate and specific that only the true Duke could possibly know it. It was a detail concerning the Ainsworth signet ring. The impostor wore a large flashy replica, but the true ring, Robert explained, had a secret, a flaw, a tiny deliberate imperfection that told a story, and that story was going to be Percy Blackwood's downfall. The night of the dinner party arrived like a judgment day. The house was ablaze with light, and filled with the chatter of our county's most important people. My parents were in their element, greeting guests with an air of smug triumph. Rosaline, utterly oblivious, was radiant in a gown of emerald green silk, her eyes sparkling every time she looked at Percy. He stood at her side, the perfect picture of a nobleman in love, accepting congratulations and charming everyone within earshot. He was at the absolute peak of his power, the conquering hero on the eve of his victory. I felt like a ghost at the feast, a silent observer moving through the crush of bodies. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror and resolve. Across the room, I saw Mr. Finch, Robert, standing quietly by the wall near the doorway, his role as the humble secretary perfectly maintained. He caught my eye for a fraction of a second and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the reassurance I had. The signal was given. The stage was set. We were seated at the grand dining table, the candlelight glinting off the polished silver and sparkling crystal. Percy was seated at my father's right, the guest of honor. He was holding court, telling a particularly amusing anecdote about a fox hunt, and the table was roaring with laughter. Sir Henry Belgrave, the magistrate, sat opposite him, a shrewd, intelligent-looking man with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He listened politely, a small, non-committal smile on his lips. My father, beaming, raised his glass. "A toast," he declared, "to my beautiful daughter Rosaline, and to her noble fiancé, His Grace, the Duke of Ainsworth." A chorus of "hear, hear" echoed around the table. Rosaline blushed beautifully. Percy inclined his head with a magnanimous smile. This was it, my moment. My hands were trembling under the table, but I forced my voice to be steady, clear, and loud enough to cut through the ensuing chatter. "Your Grace," I said, my voice sounding foreign and brave in my own ears. Every head turned towards me. It was so rare for me to speak at these events that my interruption alone was enough to cause a stir. My mother shot me a look of pure fury. Percy turned his charming smile on me, though his eyes were wary. "Yes, Matilda, forgive my interruption," I said, directing my words as much to Sir Henry as to Percy. "I was just thinking, as we are celebrating your family, I have always been fascinated by heraldry. I was reading about the Ainsworth signet ring. It's said to have a most unique, deliberate flaw in the engraving of the family crest, a missing talon on the left foot of the griffin. Is that true?" A thick, sudden silence fell over the table. My question hung in the air, seemingly innocent but loaded with invisible weight. My father's face was turning a dangerous shade of purple. Percy was caught completely off guard. He hesitated for just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, before his arrogance reasserted itself. He let out a condescending little laugh. "Ah, an old wives' tale, my dear Matilda," he said, holding up his left hand to display the large, perfect gold ring on his pinky finger. "As you can see, the craftsmanship is quite flawless. A charming story, but nothing more." He had taken the bait. He had fallen into the trap. Before anyone else could speak, Sir Henry Belgrave leaned forward, placing his wineglass down with a decisive click. His sharp eyes were fixed on Percy's ring. "That is not an old wives' tale, sir," Sir Henry said, his voice crisp and authoritative. The magistrate's tone commanded immediate attention. "It is a well-known fact among those familiar with the family's history. The fourth Duke had the ring engraved that way to commemorate a wound he received at the Battle of Blenheim, where he lost 2 fingers on his left hand. The missing talon represents his lost fingers. It is the most defining feature of the authentic piece. I have had the privilege of seeing the true ring myself, on a visit to the late Duke's guardian years ago." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and terrifying. Every guest at the table was staring at Percy, whose face had gone chalky white. The color drained from my father's face, replaced by a ghastly pallor of dawning horror. Rosaline looked from Percy to Sir Henry, her beautiful face a mask of confusion and disbelief. The air crackled with tension, with the sudden violent death of a beautiful lie. At that precise, perfect moment, the unassuming secretary stepped away from the wall. Robert Finch moved into the candlelight, and it was as if a different man had emerged. He was no longer stooped or invisible. He stood tall, his shoulders back, his presence suddenly filling the room. His voice, when he spoke, was not the quiet murmur of a servant, but the clear, commanding tone of a man born to authority. "Sir Henry is correct," he announced, his gaze sweeping the stunned faces at the table before settling on the impostor. "The ring this man wears is a forgery, as is his title." Percy sputtered, trying to rise from his chair. "This is an outrage. How dare this servant be silent?" Robert said. And the sheer force of the command made Percy sink back into his seat. Robert reached into the pocket of his modest waistcoat and pulled out a simple, worn leather pouch. With steady fingers, he undid the drawstring and tipped a ring into his palm. It was not large or flashy like Percy's, but a heavy, simple band of old gold, burnished with age. He walked around the table and held it out to the magistrate. "You will find the flaw exactly as you remember it, Sir Henry," he said, his voice ringing with absolute certainty, "because my name is Robert Finch Courtenay, and I am the 9th Duke of Ainsworth." Sir Henry took the ring, holding it up to the candlelight. He examined it for a long moment. Then his eyes met Robert's. A slow smile of recognition spread across his face. "Your Grace," he said, with a respectful nod. "It is an honor to see you have finally decided to join us." The room erupted. It was not a cheer but a collective gasp, a tidal wave of shock and astonishment. My mother made a small, strangled sound, her hand flying to her throat. My father looked as though he had been turned to stone. Percy Blackwood, the false duke, stared at Robert, his face a grotesque mixture of disbelief and terror. His grand illusion had not just been cracked, it had been atomized in a single devastating moment of truth. Rosaline's gaze darted from the sputtering con man she had almost married to the quiet, dignified man who was now revealed as the true duke. Her entire world, built on a foundation of charm and ambition, had just crumbled into dust at her feet. The impostor made a desperate lunge for the door, but two of the male guests, friends of Sir Henry, were already on their feet, blocking his path. The play was over. The handsome prince was just a common thief, and the overlooked servant was the king, and I, the quiet girl from the library, had been the one to pull back the curtain. The aftermath was a hurricane of hushed whispers and swift departures. Our guests evaporated, eager to escape the epicenter of the scandal, and even more eager to spread the story. Sir Henry, with the calm efficiency of a man used to handling crises, took charge of Percy Blackwood, assuring my father that the matter would be dealt with quietly but firmly. And then they were gone, leaving the three of us, my mother, my father, and I, standing in the wreckage of our grand dining room. The candles still flickered, the lavish food lay uneaten, the flowers drooped in their vases. It was a perfect portrait of humiliation. My mother collapsed into a chair, her body racked with silent, shuddering sobs. My father stood stiffly by the fireplace, his back to the room, staring into the flames as if he wished he could throw himself in. Rosaline had fled to her room the moment Sir Henry had led Percy away, the sound of her own heartbroken sobs echoing down the hall before being cut off by the slam of her door. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. I expected relief, vindication, maybe even gratitude. What I got was rage. My father finally turned from the fireplace, his face a twisted mask of shame and fury, and all of it was directed at me. "You," he spat, the word dripping with venom. "You did this. You couldn't just leave it alone. You had to have your moment, didn't you? You had to stand up and humiliate us in front of everyone." I stared at him, incredulous. He wasn't angry at the man who had lied to them, who had nearly destroyed their daughter's life. He was angry at me for exposing the lie. My mother looked up, her face tear-streaked and ugly. "He was a duke," she wailed, "or he seemed like one. We were going to be connected to the Ainsworths. Rosaline was going to be a duchess. And you, with your books and your cleverness, you ruined it. You ruined everything. For my entire life, I would have shrunk under the force of their anger. I would have mumbled an apology, accepted the blame, and retreated into my shell. But something inside me had changed. The girl who had trembled in the hallway under Percy's menacing grip was not the same woman who stood before them now. The validation of being right, the quiet strength I had borrowed from Robert's belief in me, had forged something new inside me, a spine of steel. "I ruined nothing," I said, my voice quiet but as hard and clear as glass. They both stopped, shocked by my tone. "I saved you. I saved Rosaline from marrying a criminal. I saved this family from being cheated, from becoming a laughingstock, from complete and utter financial ruin. You were so blinded by his title and his charm that you refused to see the liar standing right in front of you. I saw it. I tried to warn you, and you called me jealous. You called me a liar." I took a step forward, feeling a lifetime of suppressed resentment rise to the surface, not as hot anger but as a cold, immutable fact. "You should not be yelling at me. You should be on your knees, thanking me." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. The simple, unvarnished truth was more powerful than any shouting match. It stunned them into silence. They stared at me as if seeing me for the first time, not as the plain, bookish daughter, but as a stranger in their house, a woman they did not know at all. The power dynamic, which had been set in stone since my birth, had just been pulverized, and they had no idea what to do. Later that night, unable to sleep, I went to the library. It was the only place I felt I could breathe. The fire had been banked, and the room was filled with soft shadows. I ran my hand along the spines of my books, my silent, loyal friends. I knew I wasn't mistaken. The voice came from the doorway. It was Robert. I had forgotten, in the chaos, that he was still in the house. He was no longer Mr. Finch, the secretary, but he wasn't yet the Grand Duke either. He was just a man, standing in the shadows of a library, his expression gentle. "I should address you as your grace," I said, giving a small, awkward curtsy. He winced slightly. "Please don't, not you. To you I hope you will always call me Robert." He walked into the room, his footsteps quiet on the thick carpet. "I came to thank you properly, Matilda. For your intelligence, of course. But more than that, for your courage. You stood up to him, and you stood up to them. That was the harder part, I think." I just nodded, not trusting my voice. "I owe you an explanation," he continued, stopping a few feet from me. "My parents died when I was a boy. My great-uncle who raised me was a scholar. He distrusted society, its titles, its greed. He taught me to value knowledge and character above all else. When he passed last year and I was to take my place, I hesitated. I wanted to see the world not as a duke, but as a man. I wanted to see people for who they truly were, without the filter of a title. So I let the rumor of my reclusiveness continue, and I traveled. As Mr. Finch." He gave a small, wry smile. "Blackwood was an unfortunate discovery. I learned of his scam and decided to follow him, to see what kind of people would fall for it. My experiment was disheartening, until I came here." His eyes met mine, and they were filled with a sincere warmth that made my heart ache. "From the first day, I saw you. I saw how they overlooked you. I saw you in here, with your books. I saw your mind, your quiet strength. You weren't blinded by the glitter. You were looking for the truth. You were the only one." We stood there in the quiet library, the air thick with unspoken things. It was a conversation built not on charm or ambition, but on shared understanding. It was the first time in my life I had ever felt truly, completely seen. The weeks that followed were a period of strange, quiet readjustment. The scandal, as Sir Henry had promised, was handled with discretion, but the story inevitably leaked out in hushed tones at tea parties and social gatherings. The Hawthorns were not publicly shamed, but we were humbled. A deep and necessary quiet fell over our house. My father buried himself in his work, his blustering confidence replaced by a somber, reserved demeanor. My mother ceased her frantic social planning, spending most of her days in the garden, tending her roses with a silent, mournful intensity. The most profound change was in Rosaline. For a week she remained locked in her room. When she finally emerged, she was pale and subdued, the brilliant light in her eyes dimmed. She found me in the library, a place she had seldom entered in her life. She stood awkwardly in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "Matilda," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I am so sorry." Tears welled in her eyes and began to trace paths down her cheeks. "I never listened to you, not about this, not about anything. I always thought, I don't know what I thought, that you were just the clever one, and I was the pretty one, and that was how it was meant to be." She came and sat opposite me, her hands twisting in her lap. "He would have destroyed me, wouldn't he? And I would have let him, because I wanted the title, I wanted the fantasy. You tried to save me, and I let mother and father tell me you were just being jealous." It was the most honest thing she had ever said to me. In that moment, the years of rivalry and misunderstanding melted away. I saw not the perfect golden sister, but a young woman who was just as lost as I had once been. I reached across the table and took her hand. It was the beginning of a real sisterhood, one forged not in shared triumphs but in shared humility. My parents' change was slower, more grudging. They started to look at me with a new, cautious respect. Their apologies were clumsy and indirect, couched in conversations about the future, but they were there. I knew part of their newfound appreciation was self-serving. They knew the real Duke admired me, and they desperately wanted to remain in his orbit. It wasn't the perfect, heartfelt reconciliation of storybooks, but it was real. It was a start. The Duke of Ainsworth, Robert, became a frequent visitor. He never came with pomp or ceremony, often arriving on horseback with only a single groom. He would endure a polite, stilted tea with my parents before making a beeline for the library. He didn't come to see the family. He came to see me. We would spend hours among the books, our sanctuary. We talked about everything: history, philosophy, art, our childhoods. He had a brilliant, curious mind, and he treated mine as its equal. He valued my opinions, laughed at my quiet observations, and listened, truly listened, when I spoke. He wasn't courting me with grand gestures or poetic demitildations. He was courting me with respect, with shared silence, with the simple, profound gift of his attention. One afternoon, he spoke of his own estate, Blackwood Manor, the real one. He described its library, a legendary collection that had fallen into disarray over the years. "It needs a mind like yours, Matilda," he said, his gaze earnest. "Someone who sees the stories in the dust. Someone who understands that a library is not just a collection of books but the living heart of a house. I would be honored if you would consider helping me bring it back to life." It wasn't a proposal of marriage. It was a proposal of partnership, an offer of a position that was my life's dream. A few months later, I was standing in that very library. It was magnificent, a 2-story cathedral of books, with soaring, arched windows that looked out over the green hills of the Ainsworth estate. The air smelled of old paper, lemon oil, and a hint of wood smoke from the massive fireplace. I was surrounded by thousands of stories, and for the first time I felt that my own story was just beginning. I was happy, deeply and contentedly happy, in a way I had never known was possible. I was valued not in spite of my quiet, bookish nature, but because of it. Robert found me there, standing on a rolling ladder as I examined a high shelf of medieval manuscripts. He didn't say anything, just watched me for a moment with a soft smile on his face. "It suits you," he finally said. "This place. You belong here." He walked over to the foot of the ladder and looked up at me. "Matilda Hawthorne," he said, his voice suddenly serious. "You are the most intelligent, courageous, and authentic person I have ever known. You saw the truth when everyone else was captivated by a lie. You see the value in things others overlook. You see me, not the Duke but the man." He reached up and took my hand, helping me down from the ladder. He held my hand in both of his. "I am not asking the overlooked sister to become a duchess," he said, his eyes searching mine. "I am asking the brilliant woman who saved her family and who holds my complete respect and admiration, if she would do me the very great honor of becoming my wife." In the quiet of that grand old library, surrounded by the wisdom of ages, I gave him my answer, and it was yes. In the end, my story wasn't about catching a liar or winning an argument with my family. It was about learning to trust my own voice, even when I was the only one speaking. For years, I had accepted their definition of me, the plain one, the quiet one, the one who wasn't destined for a grand life. But when it mattered most, those quiet qualities, my patience, my attention to detail, my love for history, became my greatest strengths. I learned that your worth is not determined by the people who overlook you. It is something you cultivate yourself, in the quiet moments, in the pursuit of your own passions. The approval I had craved from my family for so long turned out to be meaningless compared to the quiet, steady confidence of self-respect. And when I finally found that, I found everything else.